Terrence Mitchell stood at gate C-17, first-class ticket in hand, diplomatic passport and FBI badge tucked inside his jacket pocket. Captain Douglas Whitfield stared straight into his eyes and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You are not getting on my plane." Terrence had no idea that his decision in the next 30 seconds would expose a massive corruption ring, end 5 careers, and completely transform his entire life. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. If you are ready for a story about justice, courage, and sweet revenge, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. You do not want to miss what happens next. Now let us begin. The alarm on Terrence Mitchell's phone buzzed softly at exactly 5 o'clock in the morning. He reached over and silenced it without opening his eyes, allowing himself 3 more breaths before swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His apartment in Midtown Atlanta was modest but impeccably organized. Every item had its place. Every surface was clean. The minimalist aesthetic was not a design choice but rather a reflection of a man who had spent 15 years in federal law enforcement learning that chaos in your environment leads to chaos in your mind. He walked barefoot across the hardwood floor to the window and pulled back the curtain. The Atlanta skyline glittered in the pre-dawn darkness, a constellation of office buildings and apartment towers stretching toward the Georgia sky. Terrence loved this city. He had been born in a small town called Macon, about 80 miles south, the son of a factory worker and a registered nurse. His parents had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities they never had. His father worked double shifts at the textile plant until his hands were permanently calloused. His mother took night classes to advance her nursing career while raising 2 boys. They had instilled in Terrence a simple but powerful philosophy: your dignity belongs to you, and no one can take it unless you let them. On the wall beside his bed hung a framed photograph of his parents on their 40th wedding anniversary. His father had passed away 3 years ago from complications related to decades of factory work. His mother still lived in Macon, still attended Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church every Sunday, still called him every Wednesday evening at exactly 7:30. Looking at that photograph, Terrence felt a familiar swell of gratitude and responsibility. Everything he had achieved was because of them. He dropped to the floor and began his morning exercise routine. 50 push-ups. 50 sit-ups. 30 burpees. 15 years with the FBI had taught him that physical fitness was not optional in his line of work. At 38 years old, he could still outrun agents 10 years younger. His 6'3" frame carried 210 pounds of lean muscle, maintained through discipline and dedication. After the workout, he showered, shaved, and studied his reflection in the bathroom mirror. Sharp jawline. Close-cropped hair with the faintest hint of gray at the temples. Eyes that had seen too much but still carried warmth. He selected a charcoal gray suit from his closet, a white dress shirt, and a burgundy tie. The suit had cost him $800, a luxury he rarely indulged, but today was special. Today he was flying to Washington, D.C. to receive a commendation from the FBI director himself. 3 months ago, Terrence and his team had dismantled a domestic terrorism cell that had been planning coordinated attacks on federal buildings across the Southeast. The investigation had consumed 18 months of his life, countless sleepless nights, and more danger than he cared to remember. But they had stopped the attack before a single person was harmed. 23 arrests. 0 casualties. It was the proudest achievement of his career. He clipped his FBI badge to his belt, secured his service weapon in its leather holster, and slipped his diplomatic passport into his jacket pocket. The passport was a special designation given to senior federal agents traveling on official business. It was supposed to smooth the way through airports and across borders. He grabbed his overnight bag and headed for the door. The Uber arrived at 5:45, driven by a young white man named Kyle who looked barely old enough to vote. Kyle was chatty in the way that early morning drivers sometimes are, trying to stay awake through conversation. He asked Terrence what he did for a living. Terrence smiled and said simply that he worked for the government. Kyle nodded and launched into a monologue about his cousin who worked for the IRS and hated it. Terrence listened politely, watching the Atlanta streets slide past the window. His phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca Torres, his closest colleague at the bureau. "Congratulations on tomorrow," it read. "You deserve this more than anyone. Tell the director I said hello." Terrence smiled and typed back a quick thank you. Rebecca had been his partner on the terrorism case, and she deserved as much credit as he did. She was brilliant, fearless, and had a gift for seeing patterns that others missed. If she were not Latina and he were not black, Terrence sometimes thought, the bureau might have promoted them faster. But that was a familiar frustration, one he had learned to channel into excellence rather than bitterness. The Uber pulled up to the departures terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, the busiest airport in the world. Terrence thanked Kyle, left a generous tip on the app, and stepped out into the controlled chaos of 6:30 in the morning. Travelers streamed in every direction, pulling rolling suitcases, checking phones, saying hurried goodbyes. The air smelled of jet fuel and coffee and anticipation. Terrence moved through the crowd with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly where he was going and exactly who he was. He checked in at an automated kiosk, his first-class ticket printing smoothly. The ticket had been booked by the FBI Administrative Office, standard protocol for senior agents traveling on official business. He proceeded to the TSA pre-check line, where his credentials allowed him to bypass the regular security screening. The TSA agent at the checkpoint, a black woman in her 50s whose name tag read Gloria, examined his diplomatic passport and FBI identification with professional thoroughness. Then she looked up at him and gave a small nod of recognition and respect. It was a subtle acknowledgement between two black professionals navigating predominantly white institutions. Terrence appreciated the gesture. Beyond security, he stopped at a Starbucks and ordered a large black coffee. He found a seat near the windows overlooking the tarmac and scrolled through the news on his phone. There was an article about tomorrow's commendation ceremony, mentioning him by name. Special Agent Terrence Mitchell, it read, will be recognized for his leadership in the Southeastern Counterterrorism Task Force. He read the words 3 times, still not quite believing they applied to him. The boy from Macon, Georgia, whose father had never earned more than $40,000 a year, was about to be honored by the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It felt surreal. It felt earned. It felt like the culmination of everything he had worked for. He sipped his coffee and watched a plane taxi toward the runway, its massive engines humming with restrained power. In less than 2 hours, he would be on a similar aircraft, heading to Washington, heading toward recognition, heading toward a future full of possibility. He had no way of knowing that the next 30 minutes would change everything. Gate C-17 was located at the end of a long corridor in Concourse C, past a series of shops selling overpriced magazines and neck pillows. Terrence arrived 45 minutes before the scheduled boarding time, a habit instilled by years of catching flights on short notice for bureau business. The gate area was a standard airport waiting zone, rows of gray leather seats arranged in neat lines, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac where their aircraft waited, and a digital display board showing Flight AA-447 to Washington Reagan departing at 8:30. The area was already filling with passengers. Terrence observed them with the automatic attention to detail that came from years of investigative work. A young couple in matching college sweatshirts, probably students heading home. A woman in an expensive pantsuit talking urgently into her phone, likely a lawyer or executive. A family with 3 children under 10, the parents looking exhausted before the day had even begun. And in the seat directly adjacent to where Terrence chose to sit, an elderly black man wearing a faded cap that read Vietnam Veteran. Terrence sat down and offered the old man a polite nod. The veteran returned it with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He introduced himself as Harold Jenkins, 67 years old, retired postal worker from Stone Mountain, Georgia. His voice carried the particular cadence of the Deep South, unhurried and melodic. Terrence liked him immediately. Harold explained that he was flying to Washington to see his daughter, Denise, who was battling stage 4 ovarian cancer at Georgetown University Medical Center. The doctors had given her weeks, maybe days. This trip was to say goodbye. Harold's eyes glistened as he spoke, but his voice remained steady. He was a man who had learned to carry grief with dignity, probably from his time in the jungle of Vietnam 50 years ago. Terrence listened without interruption, feeling the weight of Harold's story settle into his chest. When the old man finished, Terrence placed a hand on his shoulder and said that if there was anything he could do, anything at all, Harold should not hesitate to ask. The veteran looked at Terrence with surprise and gratitude, as if he had not expected kindness from a stranger. They shook hands, and Terrence felt the rough calluses on Harold's palm, the hands of a working man, a fighting man, a surviving man. The gate agent, a young white woman whose name tag identified her as Jennifer, picked up the intercom microphone and announced that boarding would begin shortly. First-class passengers and those requiring special assistance were invited to board first. Terrence gathered his overnight bag and prepared to move toward the jet bridge. That was when Captain Douglas Whitfield emerged from the aircraft. He stepped through the jet bridge door and into the gate area with the swagger of a man accustomed to authority. His uniform was immaculate, the crisp white shirt with 4 gold stripes on each epaulette indicating his rank as captain, the navy blue jacket tailored perfectly to his shoulders, the gold wings pinned above his left breast pocket. His hair was silver white and swept back from a tanned forehead. His jaw was square and clean-shaven. He looked like a recruitment poster for airline pilots, the kind of man who had probably been told his entire life that he looked like he belonged in a cockpit. Whitfield surveyed the gate area with a proprietary air, as if the passengers waiting to board were visitors to his personal kingdom. He announced in a booming voice that he would be personally welcoming first-class passengers aboard today, a special touch to ensure a pleasant flight experience. Several passengers murmured appreciatively. The young couple in college sweatshirts whispered to each other, impressed. A line formed at the jet bridge entrance. The lawyer in the pantsuit was first, extending her hand for a handshake that Whitfield accepted warmly. A businessman in a designer suit was next, receiving the same treatment. An Asian family with 2 young children approached, and Whitfield bent down to give the kids' wings pins from his pocket. The scene was picture-perfect hospitality. Then it was Terrence's turn. He approached the jet bridge entrance with his boarding pass and passport in hand. Whitfield turned to greet him, and something shifted in the pilot's expression. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible clenching of the jaw. The warm smile that had welcomed the previous passengers cooled by several degrees. Whitfield's gaze traveled slowly from Terrence's face down to his polished shoes and back up again, performing an assessment that was impossible to misinterpret. Whitfield did not extend his hand. He did not offer a greeting. Instead, he took Terrence's boarding pass and examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to the light as if checking for forgery. Then he turned to Jennifer, the gate agent, and asked in a voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear who had booked this particular passenger in first class. Jennifer looked confused. She glanced at her computer screen and confirmed that the ticket had been purchased through a corporate account. Whitfield nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Terrence's face. And that was when Captain Douglas Whitfield asked the question that would set everything in motion. He looked Terrence directly in the eyes and said with unmistakable condescension, "Where exactly did you get the money for a first-class ticket?" The gate area went quiet. Passengers who had been preparing to board stopped what they were doing. Jennifer's face flushed red with second-hand embarrassment. Harold Jenkins, still seated nearby, looked up with sharp attention. Even the children from the Asian family sensed the sudden tension and fell silent. Terrence felt a familiar cold anger crystallize in his chest. He had encountered this particular brand of racism countless times throughout his life and career. The assumptions. The suspicion. The belief that a black man in a position of privilege must have somehow stolen or scammed his way there. But he had learned long ago that anger, however justified, was a tool that had to be wielded carefully. So he kept his voice calm and his expression neutral as he replied that his employer had booked the ticket. Whitfield raised an eyebrow. And what exactly was it that Terrence did for a living? This was the moment when Terrence could have ended the confrontation. He could have produced his FBI credentials and watched the color drain from Whitfield's face. He could have asserted his authority and demanded an apology. But something stopped him. Call it intuition. Call it the investigator's instinct that had served him so well over 15 years. He wanted to see exactly how far this pilot would go. He wanted to document the full extent of the man's prejudice. So he simply said that he worked for the government. Whitfield's eyes narrowed. He turned to Jennifer and announced that he had security concerns about this passenger and required her to perform additional verification of the ticket. Jennifer looked helplessly between the pilot and Terrence, clearly aware that something deeply wrong was happening but unsure of her authority to intervene. She began typing on her computer, her hands visibly trembling. Other passengers had stopped boarding entirely now. They formed a loose semicircle around the gate entrance, watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from discomfort to outrage. A white man in an expensive suit, who Terrence would later learn was a civil rights attorney named Richard, had pulled out his phone and was recording the interaction. The camera's presence seemed to go unnoticed by Whitfield, who was wholly focused on the black man standing before him. The confrontation had begun. And neither man knew yet just how much was about to unravel. Captain Douglas Whitfield planted his feet and crossed his arms over his chest, assuming a posture of absolute authority. He announced in a voice that carried across the entire gate area that as captain of this aircraft, he had full authority to deny boarding to any passenger he deemed a security risk. His tone was calm, even reasonable, the practiced delivery of a man who had clearly done this before. Terrence remained motionless, his overnight bag resting at his feet, his expression betraying nothing of the fury building behind his eyes. He asked Whitfield to explain what specific security concern he posed. What evidence supported the captain's assessment? What had he done to warrant this treatment? Whitfield did not answer directly. Instead, he smiled a thin, condescending smile and said that his experience told him everything he needed to know. 3 decades of flying had given him instincts about people, instincts that had kept his passengers safe. He was not required to justify those instincts to anyone, least of all to the subject of his concern. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Every passenger within earshot understood what Whitfield was really saying. His instincts had nothing to do with security and everything to do with the color of Terrence's skin. The Asian family quietly gathered their children and retreated to seats far from the gate entrance. The lawyer in the pantsuit lowered her phone, apparently having joined the documentation effort. Jennifer, the gate agent, looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Richard, the civil rights attorney, stepped forward. He was a white man in his late 40s with graying temples and the confident bearing of someone who spent his professional life in courtrooms. He introduced himself and stated clearly that what he was witnessing appeared to be a textbook case of racial discrimination. He advised Captain Whitfield that his actions were being recorded by multiple passengers and that he should reconsider his position before exposing his employer to significant legal liability. Whitfield turned to Richard with barely concealed irritation. He told the attorney that this was a matter between the captain and a potential passenger and that outside interference was neither welcome nor appropriate. Richard did not back down. He said that discrimination became everyone's business when it happened in a public space. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if Harold Jenkins had not risen from his seat. The elderly veteran moved with deliberate slowness, his joints protesting the effort, but his spine was straight and his eyes were clear. He walked to where Terrence stood and positioned himself at the younger man's side. Harold's voice was quiet but carried the weight of someone who had earned the right to speak. He identified himself as a veteran of the United States Army, having served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division. He said that he had seen a lot of disgraceful things in his 70 years of life, but what was happening at this gate ranked among the worst. A man was being denied boarding on an airplane in the year 2024 based on nothing but the color of his skin. It was shameful. It was un-American. And it would not stand. Whitfield's face reddened. He told Harold that this did not concern him and ordered him to return to his seat immediately. When Harold did not move, Whitfield raised his voice and called for airport security to remove both of these men from the boarding area. 2 security officers arrived within moments, having apparently been alerted by the growing commotion. One was a black man in his 30s whose name tag read Officer Williams. The other was a white man of similar age named Officer Murphy. They assessed the situation with professional detachment, looking from Whitfield to Terrence to Harold and back again. Officer Williams asked Whitfield to explain the nature of the disturbance. The pilot straightened to his full height and declared that these two individuals did not belong in first class. He wanted their tickets verified and their identities confirmed. His tone implied that the officers should share his suspicions simply because he, as an airline captain, had expressed them. Williams and Murphy exchanged a glance. Officer Williams asked Whitfield to clarify what he meant by "don't belong." Was there a specific threat? A specific behavior? A specific policy violation? Whitfield hesitated. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to recognize that he was on uncertain ground. He stammered that it was a judgment call, that his experience as a captain gave him certain authorities, that he was simply trying to protect his passengers and crew. By now, the scene had attracted attention far beyond Gate C-17. Passengers at neighboring gates had stopped to watch. Travelers walking through the concourse slowed to observe the commotion. The digital information display above the gate showed that boarding was now delayed, and the scheduled departure time flashed red as if in warning. Flight attendant Margaret Sullivan emerged from the jet bridge. She was a woman in her late 50s with graying hair pinned neatly beneath her uniform cap, the kind of seasoned professional who had spent decades managing difficult passengers and delicate situations. She took in the scene at a glance and immediately understood that something had gone terribly wrong. Margaret approached Whitfield and asked, with careful diplomatic precision, what exactly was the problem here. She noted that the gentleman in the gray suit appeared to be a ticketed first-class passenger. She asked what specific reason Captain Whitfield had for denying his boarding. Whitfield turned to his senior flight attendant with obvious frustration. He said that he did not feel comfortable with these passengers on his aircraft. That was his professional judgment, and that should be enough. Margaret's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She reminded the captain that airline policy required a documented reason for denying boarding to any ticketed passenger. Personal discomfort was not sufficient grounds. Without a specific security concern or policy violation, the airline could face serious consequences. The standoff had reached a critical moment. Whitfield was cornered, but cornered animals often become most dangerous. He drew himself up and declared that he was the captain of this aircraft. His word was law on board. If he said these men were not flying, then they were not flying. Anyone who had a problem with that could file a complaint after the fact. Richard the attorney laughed out loud. He announced that he was absolutely going to file a complaint, along with a civil rights lawsuit and a formal grievance with the Department of Transportation. He asked if anyone else wanted to join him as a witness and co-plaintiff. Several hands went up around the gate area. Whitfield's face had gone from red to a mottled purple. His composure was cracking, revealing something ugly beneath the polished exterior. He pointed at Terrence and Harold and said with undisguised venom that people like them always wanted to make trouble. They always wanted to play the victim. Well, not on his watch. Not on his aircraft. The phrase, people like them, echoed through the terminal. It was the moment when subtext became text, when coded language gave way to naked prejudice. Even passengers who had been uncertain about what they were witnessing could no longer deny the nature of the conflict. This was racism, raw and unfiltered, playing out in real time at one of the busiest airports in America. Officer Williams stepped forward. His professional demeanor had hardened into something colder, more personal. He told Whitfield that he was going to need the captain to come with him for additional questioning. There were serious allegations being made, and the airport authority needed to investigate before this flight could proceed. Whitfield looked genuinely shocked, as if it had never occurred to him that his authority might be challenged, that his actions might have consequences. He sputtered that he had a flight to captain, that hundreds of passengers were waiting, that this was an outrageous overreach. But Officer Williams was unmoved. The captain could answer questions voluntarily, or the officer could escalate to the Atlanta Police Department. The choice was his. For the first time since the confrontation began, Douglas Whitfield looked afraid. And that was the moment Terrence Mitchell decided to end the charade. The tension at Gate C-17 had reached a breaking point. Passengers stood frozen in place, phones raised, witnessing what they knew would become a viral moment. Officer Williams waited for Captain Whitfield's response, his hand resting casually on his radio, ready to call for backup. Margaret Sullivan wrung her hands, calculating the damage to her airline's reputation. Harold Jenkins stood firm beside Terrence, a sentinel of solidarity. And Douglas Whitfield, for all his bluster, seemed to be shrinking before their eyes. Terrence assessed the situation with the cold clarity that 15 years of federal law enforcement had instilled in him. He had gathered enough evidence. Multiple witnesses. Multiple recordings. A clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. But there was something else nagging at him, an investigator's instinct telling him that Whitfield's desperation was disproportionate to the situation. The man was not just racist. He was afraid of something deeper. Terrence decided to accelerate the confrontation. He moved his hand slowly toward his jacket pocket. The movement was deliberate, controlled, designed to be visible to everyone watching. Whitfield's eyes locked onto Terrence's hand, and panic flooded his face. He shouted that the man was reaching for a weapon and called for security to take him down. Officers Williams and Murphy reacted on instinct, their hands moving to their holstered weapons, their bodies tensing into tactical postures. The passengers gasped and stepped backward. For one terrifying second, the situation teetered on the edge of tragedy. But Terrence did not stop moving. With exaggerated slowness, he withdrew his leather credential case from his jacket. He held it up at eye level, letting the fluorescent airport lights catch the gold shield inside. Then he flipped it open, revealing the FBI credentials that identified him as Special Agent Terrence Mitchell of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His voice cut through the chaos like a blade. He announced his name and his position clearly, ensuring that every person within earshot understood exactly who they were dealing with. He stated that he was a 15-year veteran of the Bureau, currently assigned to the Atlanta Field Office as Senior Special Agent in the Counterterrorism Division. He was traveling to Washington, D.C. on official government business to receive a commendation from the FBI director. And he had just been denied boarding on a commercial aircraft because of the color of his skin. Silence crashed down on Gate C-17 like a physical weight. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one seemed to breathe. Whitfield's face had gone from purple to gray, the blood draining from his cheeks as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. Jennifer the gate agent covered her mouth with both hands. Margaret Sullivan closed her eyes and shook her head slowly. Officer Williams lowered his hand from his weapon and let out a long breath. It was Harold Jenkins who broke the silence. The old veteran looked at Terrence with an expression of profound satisfaction and said that he had known there was something special about this young man from the moment they started talking. He reached out and clapped Terrence on the shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood between two men who understood what it meant to be underestimated because of their skin. Richard the attorney laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it. He said that this was going to be the most spectacular civil rights case of his career. He asked Terrence if he had representation yet, because he would be honored to take the case pro bono. Whitfield finally found his voice. It came out thin and reedy, nothing like the commanding tone he had projected minutes earlier. He said that this was all a misunderstanding. He claimed that he had simply been following protocol, that he had no way of knowing the passengers' credentials, that he was only trying to ensure the safety of his aircraft. Terrence turned to face Whitfield directly. His voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. He asked what protocol specifically required airline captains to question black passengers about how they afforded their tickets. He asked what security training taught pilots to assume criminality based on skin color. He asked why every white passenger had received a handshake and a smile while he had received suspicion and humiliation. Whitfield had no answers. His mouth opened and closed without producing words. The confident airline captain who had strutted out of the jet bridge 20 minutes earlier had been replaced by a sweating, stammering shell of a man. Margaret Sullivan stepped forward. She said that she needed to contact the airline's crisis management team immediately. She asked Officer Williams if the captain could be detained while they sorted through the situation. Williams nodded and gestured for his partner to escort Whitfield to an airport security office. Whitfield resisted for a moment, his pride refusing to accept the reversal of fortune. He said that he was the captain of this aircraft, that he had authority, that this was not over. But his protests sounded hollow, the complaints of a man who had already lost. As Murphy led Whitfield away, Terrence pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Director Samuel Crawford answered on the second ring. Terrence explained the situation in concise terms, professional language conveying the basic facts while hinting at the larger implications he sensed lurking beneath the surface. Crawford listened without interruption, then said he was dispatching a team to Hartsfield-Jackson immediately. He told Terrence to stay put and keep witnesses on scene if possible. Now I want to pause here and ask you something. Do you think Terrence made the right decision to wait before revealing his FBI credentials? Comment number 1 if you believe he should have identified himself immediately to avoid the confrontation. Comment number 2 if you think his patience helped expose the full extent of Whitfield's racism. I genuinely want to know your thoughts, so drop your answer in the comments below. And while you are there, if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We are just getting to the good part. What do you think happens when the FBI starts digging into Captain Douglas Whitfield's background? Will this turn out to be an isolated incident of racism, or is there something darker hiding beneath the surface? Stay with me, because the answers are about to shock everyone involved. Agent Rebecca Torres arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport within 25 minutes of Director Crawford's call. She came with a team of 3 agents from the Atlanta field office, all of them moving with the purposeful efficiency that characterized FBI operations. Rebecca was a striking woman in her mid-30s, her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, her brown eyes sharp and analytical behind frameless glasses. She had been born in Miami to Cuban immigrant parents and had worked her way through college and law school before joining the bureau. She and Terrence had been partners for 4 years, and she knew him better than almost anyone. She found him standing near gate C-17, surrounded by passengers who had refused to leave despite the flight delay. Many of them wanted to provide statements, wanted to make sure their accounts of what they had witnessed were officially documented. Rebecca embraced Terrence briefly, a gesture that was outside normal professional protocol but felt necessary given the circumstances. She told him she had seen the videos already. They were all over social media, accumulating millions of views and outraged comments. The hashtag Atlanta Airport Racism was trending nationally. Terrence nodded but seemed distracted. He explained to Rebecca that something about Whitfield's behavior did not add up. The man's reaction had been disproportionate, his fear too intense for a simple act of prejudice. Racists were common enough in Terrence's experience, and most of them were brazenly confident in their bigotry. Whitfield had been something else. He had been paranoid, almost desperate. It suggested that the captain had something to hide beyond his obvious racism. Rebecca trusted Terrence's instincts. She pulled out her tablet and began running background checks through the FBI's secure database. Within minutes, she had Douglas Whitfield's complete personnel file on screen. 28 years with Atlantic Airways. Spotless safety record. Commendations for calm handling of emergency situations. On paper, he was an exemplary pilot. But Rebecca dug deeper. She accessed a database of civil complaints filed with the Department of Transportation, cross-referencing them with Atlantic Airways flights captained by Whitfield. What she found was disturbing. Over the past 3 years, there had been 7 formal complaints of racial discrimination against Whitfield, all filed by black passengers, all involving denial of boarding or forced rebooking under suspicious circumstances. In each case, Atlantic Airways had settled quietly out of court, paying substantial sums to make the problems disappear. There was no record of Whitfield ever being disciplined. Terrence studied the pattern with growing alarm. 7 incidents in 3 years, all involving black passengers, all swept under the rug. Either Atlantic Airways had a catastrophic failure of oversight, or someone high up in the company was actively protecting Douglas Whitfield. Neither possibility was acceptable. Rebecca continued her investigation, following the thread wherever it led. She accessed Whitfield's financial records through a provisional warrant that Director Crawford had obtained while en route to the airport. What she found there was the first concrete evidence that something criminal was occurring. Douglas Whitfield had a bank account in the Cayman Islands containing over $800,000. The deposits had been made in irregular amounts over the past 5 years, none of them traceable to his Atlantic Airways salary. Terrence leaned over Rebecca's shoulder, his mind racing through possibilities. Offshore accounts were classic indicators of money laundering or bribery. A pilot would not need that kind of untraceable wealth unless he was being paid for something beyond his legitimate duties. They cross-referenced Whitfield's flight schedule with customs and import records. The pattern that emerged was subtle but unmistakable. On flights captained by Whitfield, there was a statistically significant reduction in customs inspections of checked luggage. Cargo holds on his aircraft passed through screening with unusual speed, often bypassing secondary inspection protocols entirely. Someone was using Whitfield's position to move goods through airport security with minimal scrutiny. Rebecca traced the ownership of the shell company making deposits to Whitfield's offshore account. It was registered in Delaware, a state notorious for minimal corporate disclosure requirements. But the FBI had tools that penetrated such barriers. Within minutes, she had identified the company's beneficial owner, a trading firm called Atlantic Luxury Imports, which specialized in high-end goods supposedly sourced from European manufacturers. The firm had been flagged by Customs and Border Protection 2 years ago for suspected involvement in smuggling counterfeit luxury goods. The investigation had stalled when key witnesses became uncooperative and physical evidence mysteriously disappeared. Reading between the lines of the CBP report, Terrence recognized the hallmarks of a sophisticated operation with inside help. Everything clicked into place. Douglas Whitfield was not just a racist. He was a corrupt pilot facilitating a smuggling ring that moved counterfeit luxury goods through commercial aircraft. His discrimination against black passengers was not merely prejudice. It was paranoia. 5 years ago, according to the CBP report, the smuggling operation had nearly been exposed by an undercover DEA agent who happened to be black. Since then, Whitfield had been obsessively screening passengers, denying boarding to anyone who triggered his fear of federal surveillance. Terrence shook his head in disbelief. The man had created a pattern of discrimination specifically to protect a criminal enterprise. The racism and the corruption were intertwined, each feeding the other in a cycle of injustice. Rebecca was already on the phone with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, requesting an emergency expansion of the investigation. Director Crawford had arrived at the airport and was coordinating with local law enforcement to secure the scene. What had started as a civil rights incident was rapidly evolving into a major federal criminal case. And Terrence, who had simply been trying to catch a flight to his commendation ceremony, found himself at the center of it all. Douglas Whitfield sat in the airport security office, his wrists uncuffed but his freedom constrained by the presence of 2 uniformed officers outside the door. He had demanded an attorney 3 times, and one was supposedly en route. But in the meantime, no one had thought to confiscate his personal cell phone. He typed a message with trembling fingers, addressing it to his son Bradley. The message was brief but urgent, code red. Clean everything. Bring the backup drive to the airport. Do not get caught. Bradley Whitfield was 28 years old, a junior pilot with Atlantic Airways who had followed in his father's footsteps. He was also deeply involved in the smuggling operation, handling logistics and communications while his father ensured safe passage through airport security. When he received his father's message, he understood immediately what needed to be done. He drove to his father's house in the upscale Buckhead neighborhood, using his spare key to enter. He knew exactly where his father kept the physical evidence, a fireproof safe in the basement containing external hard drives loaded with transaction records, shipping manifests, and encrypted communications with their partners. Bradley emptied the safe into a duffel bag, his hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. He also made a phone call. On the other end was Senator Richard Hayes of Georgia, a 3-term Republican who had built his career on law and order rhetoric while secretly taking payments from the smuggling network. The Whitfields had helped move hundreds of thousands of dollars in campaign contributions, laundered through a web of shell corporations and super PACs. If Douglas fell, he could take the senator down with him. Senator Hayes listened to Bradley's frantic explanation with growing horror. He made a call of his own, this one to the FBI's Washington headquarters. He spoke to a deputy director who owed him political favors, spinning a story about overzealous agents harassing a distinguished airline captain based on a misunderstanding. He demanded that the Atlanta investigation be shut down immediately. The deputy director passed the request to Director Samuel Crawford, framing it as a suggestion from powerful congressional allies. Crawford, a career lawman with no patience for political interference, was unimpressed. But he was also pragmatic. He called Terrence at the airport and delivered unwelcome news. Crawford's voice was tight with frustration as he explained the situation. There was pressure from above to stand down, to treat the incident as a simple civil rights matter and let Atlantic Airways handle the disciplinary action internally. The criminal investigation into Whitfield's finances was being questioned. Crawford said he needed Terrence to pause the investigation temporarily while he navigated the political minefield. Terrence felt his stomach drop. He asked Crawford if he was being ordered to abandon a case that clearly involved federal crimes. The evidence was overwhelming. Letting Whitfield walk would be a miscarriage of justice. Crawford sighed heavily. He said he was not ordering anything. He was asking Terrence to use his judgment, to consider the broader implications, to give him time to work the system. But he also said that if Terrence chose to continue investigating, he would not have official support. His career could suffer. His commendation could be jeopardized. Terrence did not hesitate. He told Crawford, with all due respect, that his career had been on the line the moment Whitfield looked at his skin and decided he did not belong. He was not going to abandon the truth now. He would continue the investigation with or without official backing. Crawford was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that Terrence would remember for the rest of his life. He said he had hoped Terrence would say that. He said he was proud to have agents with that kind of integrity. And he said that, officially, this conversation never happened. Rebecca Torres had been listening to Terrence's end of the call. When he hung up, she said simply that she was with him. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Several other agents from the Atlanta office expressed similar solidarity. They were all taking a risk, but they believed in the mission. The next few hours were a race against time. While Bradley Whitfield sped toward the airport with a duffel bag full of incriminating evidence, FBI agents worked frantically to build a case that could withstand political interference. They interviewed passengers who had witnessed the gate incident. They pulled surveillance footage showing Whitfield's discriminatory behavior. They documented the pattern of settled complaints that Atlantic Airways had hidden from regulators. And they got lucky. Bradley Whitfield was not a skilled criminal. He was a frightened young man in over his head, driving too fast, making poor decisions. When he reached the airport, he parked in a loading zone near the departures terminal, drawing the attention of a traffic enforcement officer. When the officer approached the vehicle, Bradley panicked. He grabbed the duffel bag and ran. He made it approximately 50 feet before Agent Rebecca Torres intercepted him. She had been watching the terminal entrances on a hunch, and Bradley's erratic behavior triggered every alarm in her investigative brain. She identified herself as FBI and ordered him to stop. When he kept running, she pursued. She caught him near a security checkpoint, tackling him to the ground with a precision that belied her compact frame. The duffel bag spilled open, scattering external hard drives across the polished airport floor. Bradley struggled briefly, then went limp, realizing the futility of resistance. Rebecca looked at the hard drives scattered around her and allowed herself a small smile. She called Terrence on her radio and said that he needed to see this. Bradley Whitfield had just hand-delivered every piece of evidence they needed. When Terrence arrived at the scene, he found Bradley handcuffed on the ground, looking up at him with an expression of absolute despair. The young pilot had been trying to destroy evidence. Instead, he had carried it directly into the arms of the FBI. Terrence crouched down to meet Bradley's eyes. He said that the young man had a choice to make. He could stay loyal to his father and spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Or he could cooperate with the investigation and potentially salvage some portion of his future. The decision was his. Bradley looked at the hard drives, at the agents surrounding him, at the career and life that was collapsing around him. Then he started to talk. The technical analysis of Bradley Whitfield's hard drives took less than 2 hours. FBI forensic specialists worked through the encrypted files with tools developed for counterterrorism operations, cracking passwords and decrypting communications with ruthless efficiency. What they found was staggering in its scope. The smuggling operation had been running for 7 years, moving over $50 million in counterfeit luxury goods through Atlanta's airport. Douglas Whitfield was the linchpin, using his authority as captain to ensure that specific cargo holds went uninspected. He communicated with his handlers through encrypted messaging apps, receiving instructions about which flights would carry contraband and which customs agents could be avoided. But Whitfield was not the mastermind. The operation's leadership included 2 other Atlantic Airways pilots, both of whom had received similar offshore payments. It included 2 senior executives at the airline who had authorized the settlement payments to discrimination victims, ensuring that Whitfield's behavior never triggered a formal investigation. And it included Senator Richard Hayes, who had used his position on the Senate Commerce Committee to block regulatory scrutiny of Atlantic Airways security procedures. The evidence was overwhelming. Email chains showed Senator Hayes personally intervening to kill a CBP investigation. Financial records traced campaign contributions back to the smuggling network's shell companies. Text messages revealed coordinated efforts to intimidate witnesses and destroy evidence. When Director Crawford reviewed the files, he made an immediate call to the Department of Justice. Within an hour, arrest warrants were being prepared for every member of the conspiracy. Political interference was no longer possible. The evidence was too damning, the exposure too public. Anyone who tried to protect the conspirators now would be destroyed alongside them. Patricia Coleman, Atlantic Airways Chief Executive Officer, arrived at the airport expecting to manage a public relations crisis. She was a polished corporate leader in her mid-40s, dressed in a designer suit that cost more than most Americans earned in a month. She had built her career on smooth handling of difficult situations, and she was confident she could contain this one. She did not know that her name appeared 17 times in the seized communications. She did not know that Douglas Whitfield had identified her as the executive who approved his participation in the smuggling ring. She did not know that federal agents had already obtained a warrant for her arrest. Agent Torres intercepted Coleman as she entered the terminal, flanked by 2 additional agents. Torres recited the Miranda warning with professional detachment, informing Coleman that she had the right to remain silent, that anything she said could be used against her in court, that she had the right to an attorney. Coleman's composure shattered. She screamed that this was a mistake, that she had done nothing wrong, that her lawyers would have everyone's badges. The arrest happened in full view of passengers, airline employees, and the media that had gathered to cover the story. Cameras captured Coleman being led away in handcuffs, her designer suit rumpled, her carefully styled hair coming undone. The images would dominate news coverage for days. Similar scenes played out across the city and beyond. FBI teams arrested the 2 complicit pilots at their homes, catching them in the middle of frantic efforts to destroy evidence. They arrested the other executives at Atlantic Airways headquarters, interrupting a crisis management meeting that had been focused on saving the company's reputation. And in Washington, D.C., federal marshals arrived at Senator Hayes's office with a warrant that made his staffers gasp in disbelief. The senator tried to bluff his way out. He invoked his constitutional privileges, demanded to speak with the Senate Majority Leader, threatened investigations into the FBI itself. None of it worked. The evidence was too solid, the case too public, the political calculus too clear. Even his fellow Republicans understood that defending Hayes would be suicide. Douglas Whitfield watched the collapse of his empire from the airport security office, where he had been held since the morning's confrontation. When agents came to formally charge him with racketeering, smuggling, and civil rights violations, he seemed almost relieved that the charade was finally over. 28 years of careful deception had unraveled in a single day, all because he could not resist harassing a black man in a first-class line. Director Crawford called Terrence personally to congratulate him. The director said that what had started as an act of racism had exposed one of the largest corruption cases in recent FBI history. He said that Terrence's refusal to back down, his insistence on following the evidence wherever it led, had made this possible. The commendation ceremony in Washington would proceed as scheduled, but now there would be additional recognition for the day's extraordinary work. Terrence thanked the director but felt strangely empty. He was glad that justice would be served, glad that the smuggling ring had been dismantled, glad that corrupt officials would face consequences. But he also knew that none of it would have happened if Douglas Whitfield had simply let a black man board an airplane. The racism that had triggered the investigation was its own tragedy, independent of the crimes it had accidentally exposed. Harold Jenkins found Terrence standing alone near the windows of Gate C-17, looking out at the tarmac where their flight still sat, hours delayed by the chaos. The old veteran put a hand on Terrence's shoulder and said that he had witnessed something remarkable today. He said that in all his years, through Vietnam and the civil rights movement and everything since, he had never seen justice work so swiftly and so completely. He said that Terrence should be proud. Terrence turned to Harold and asked about his daughter. In all the chaos, he had not forgotten why the old man was traveling. Harold's eyes glistened, but he smiled. He said that the airline had arranged a private flight for him, free of charge, as part of their desperate attempt at damage control. He would reach Washington by evening. He would see his Denise. The two men embraced, black strangers who had become brothers in the space of a few hours. Then Harold walked away toward his gate, his Vietnam veteran cap perched proudly on his head. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta had never seen a case quite like this. 3 months after the airport incident, the prosecution of Douglas Whitfield and his co-conspirators began with unprecedented media attention. Camera crews from every major network lined the streets. Protesters gathered on the courthouse steps, some demanding maximum sentences, others claiming the defendants were victims of government overreach. Inside the courtroom, history was being written. Terrence Mitchell took the witness stand on the 4th day of trial. He wore his best suit, the charcoal gray one he had intended to wear to his commendation ceremony. He had worn it that day after all, but only after giving a statement to federal prosecutors that lasted 6 hours. Now he would tell his story to a jury of 12 citizens, none of whom had been able to avoid hearing about the case but all of whom had sworn to judge fairly based on the evidence. The prosecutor, a veteran of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, led Terrence through the events of that February morning. He described arriving at the airport, meeting Harold Jenkins, approaching the boarding gate. He described Whitfield's questions, his tone, his clear assumption that a black man could not legitimately afford first-class travel. He described the escalation, the involvement of security, the moment when he revealed his FBI credentials. The defense attorneys tried to challenge his account. They suggested that Terrence had exaggerated Whitfield's behavior, that the captain's concerns had been legitimate security precautions, that the racial element was being manufactured to sensationalize the case. Terrence answered every question calmly, referring defense counsel to the multiple video recordings that passengers had made. Those videos were played for the jury in their entirety. They showed Whitfield greeting white passengers warmly while interrogating Terrence with suspicion. They captured his exact words, his tone, his body language. They recorded him calling for security to remove these people from the boarding area. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative interpretation. Douglas Whitfield's racism was preserved in high definition. Harold Jenkins also testified. The old veteran described what he had witnessed, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. He talked about serving his country in Vietnam, about coming home to a nation that still treated him as second class, about spending his life hoping things would get better. He said that what happened at Gate C-17 showed that racism was still alive in America, still powerful, still causing harm. But he also said that the response gave him hope. People had stood up. The system had worked. Justice was being served. When the jury retired to deliberate, they took less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts for Douglas Whitfield. Guilty for Bradley Whitfield, though with reduced charges in exchange for his cooperation. Guilty for Patricia Coleman and the other executives. Guilty for Senator Richard Hayes, whose political career had ended the moment federal marshals walked into his office. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Douglas Whitfield received 20 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. His son Bradley received 5 years, with eligibility for early release based on good behavior. Patricia Coleman received 12 years and was ordered to forfeit all assets derived from the smuggling operation. The other conspirators received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years, depending on their level of involvement. Senator Hayes received the harshest sentence of all, 25 years. The judge specifically cited his abuse of public trust, his use of political power to obstruct justice, and his utter lack of remorse throughout the proceedings. As marshals led him away in handcuffs, the former senator looked like a man who still could not believe this was happening to him. Atlantic Airways faced consequences as well. The Department of Transportation levied record fines for safety violations and civil rights breaches. The company was required to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all employees, establish an independent oversight board, and pay restitution to every passenger who had been wrongly denied boarding. The total cost exceeded $100 million. 1 month after the sentencing hearings, Terrence finally made it to Washington, D.C. for his commendation ceremony. The event had been expanded significantly from its original scope. In addition to his counterterrorism work, Terrence was being recognized for his role in exposing the Atlantic Airways conspiracy. The FBI director, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of Homeland Security all attended. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall of the Department of Justice, beneath the murals depicting the history of American law. Terrence stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces. Fellow agents, prosecutors, dignitaries, and in the front row, his mother, who had made the trip from Macon for the proudest day of her life. Rebecca Torres was also honored, receiving a commendation for her critical role in the investigation. She stood beside Terrence as cameras flashed, both of them representing something larger than themselves, the promise that justice could prevail even against powerful enemies, that the system could work when good people refused to give up. Terrence's speech was brief but powerful. He talked about his parents, about the sacrifices they had made to give him opportunities. He talked about his father's belief that dignity was something no one could take from you. He talked about the morning at the airport, when a racist pilot had looked at him and seen a threat instead of a fellow American. And he talked about what happened next. How witnesses refused to be silent, how colleagues refused to back down, how a corrupt network was exposed because one man thought his prejudices made him untouchable. He ended with words that would be quoted in newspapers across the country: Douglas Whitfield thought he could decide where I belonged. He was wrong. I belong wherever I choose to be. We all do. And the moment we forget that, the moment we let others define our place in this world, we lose something precious. Today, I want everyone watching to remember, your dignity belongs to you. No one can take it unless you let them. The applause lasted several minutes. When it finally faded, Terrence found Harold Jenkins waiting for him at the edge of the crowd. The old veteran had traveled back to Washington for the ceremony. His daughter Denise had passed away 2 weeks earlier, peacefully, with her father holding her hand. Harold's eyes were wet with grief and pride as he embraced Terrence one more time. 6 months after the trial ended, Terrence Mitchell stood at the window of his new office in the FBI's Atlanta field office, watching the city skyline catch the golden light of late afternoon. His nameplate on the door read Deputy Special Agent in Charge, Southeast Region. It was a position he had earned through 2 decades of service, but the promotion had been accelerated by the Atlantic Airways case. He was now responsible for overseeing federal investigations across 4 states, commanding a team of over 200 agents. The office was larger than any he had occupied before, with actual windows instead of fluorescent lighting, a conference table for staff meetings, and a photograph wall where he displayed memories of significant cases. The Atlantic Airways case had its own section. News clippings, the official FBI commendation certificate, and a photograph of him standing with Harold Jenkins at the Department of Justice ceremony. Rebecca Torres knocked on his open door. She had been promoted to special agent in charge of the Major Crimes Task Force, working directly under Terrence's supervision. They made an effective team, complementing each other's strengths, pushing each other to be better. She told him that he had mail, handing over a stack of letters that his assistant had screened and sorted. Most of the letters were routine, interdepartmental memos, case updates, scheduling requests. But one envelope stood out. It was addressed by hand in cramped, uneven script. The return address was the Federal Correctional Institution in Jessup, Georgia. Terrence recognized it immediately as the facility where Douglas Whitfield was serving his sentence. He sat down at his desk and studied the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, covered on both sides with the same cramped handwriting. The letter was from Douglas Whitfield himself. Terrence read it slowly, absorbing every word. Whitfield did not ask for forgiveness. He did not claim to be innocent or wrongfully convicted. He did not make excuses for his crimes or his racism. Instead, he explained. He wrote about his father, a pilot in the 1960s who had been one of the first to fly commercial jets. His father had believed absolutely in a hierarchy of human worth, with white men at the top and everyone else arranged beneath in descending order. He had taught Douglas that certain spaces were reserved for certain people, that mixing was dangerous, that vigilance against outsiders was a form of patriotism. Douglas had absorbed these lessons completely. He had built his entire identity around them. When he looked at black passengers in first class, he saw invaders in territory where they did not belong. When he looked at Terrence that morning in Atlanta, he saw everything his father had taught him to fear, a successful, confident black man who refused to accept a subordinate position. The letter continued with a confession that surprised Terrence. Whitfield wrote that even now, sitting in a prison cell, he struggled to let go of his beliefs. He intellectually understood that they were wrong, that they had destroyed his life and hurt countless innocent people. But emotionally, deep in his gut where his father's voice still echoed, he felt the same fear and resentment that had always been there. However, he wrote, something had changed. Watching Terrence testify at the trial, seeing the man's dignity and composure under hostile questioning, hearing him speak about values that transcended race, Whitfield had felt something crack inside him. Not a conversion or a miraculous transformation. Just a crack, a tiny fissure in the wall of hatred he had built around himself. He wrote, I looked at you and I saw everything my father taught me to fear. But in the end, you were the one who brought me down. There's a bitter irony in that. The man I thought didn't belong turned out to be the one who belonged everywhere, while I ended up in a place where I'll spend the rest of my useful life. The letter ended without apology, without requests, without expectations. It was simply an acknowledgement, a recognition of truths that Whitfield was still struggling to fully accept. Terrence sat with the letter for a long time, reading it twice more. He showed it to Rebecca, who read it with an expression that shifted from suspicion to something approaching pity. She asked what he was going to do with it. He said he did not know yet. But something was forming in his mind, an idea that felt both frightening and necessary. 2 weeks later, Terrence drove 4 hours south to the Federal Correctional Institution in Jessup. He had called ahead, arranging a visit through official channels. The warden was confused by the request. Victims did not usually visit their tormentors in prison. But Terrence's credentials and reputation opened doors, and so he found himself sitting in a visitation room, waiting for guards to bring in Douglas Whitfield. The man who shuffled through the door bore little resemblance to the confident captain who had strutted through Gate C, 9 months earlier. Whitfield had lost weight, his formerly robust frame now gaunt beneath the orange jumpsuit. His silver hair had thinned and yellowed. His eyes, once hard with arrogance, now seemed hollow and uncertain. Prison had aged him a decade in less than a year. They sat across from each other at a metal table, a guard stationed nearby but out of earshot. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Whitfield asked why Terrence had come. Terrence considered the question carefully before answering. He said that he had read the letter. He said that he had thought about it for weeks. He said that he had tried to imagine what it would feel like to spend an entire life believing lies, to have those lies validated by everyone around you, to build your identity on a foundation that was rotten from the start. He said that none of that excused what Whitfield had done. The racism. The corruption. The lives damaged and destroyed. Those crimes deserved punishment, and punishment was being served. But Terrence had not come to discuss punishment. He had come to ask a question. Was it worth it, he asked. All those years of hate. All that energy spent believing you were better than people like me. Did it make you happy? Did it give your life meaning? Whitfield stared at the table for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said that he had wasted his life. He said that the superiority he felt had been hollow, that the hatred had poisoned everything it touched. He said that he was 60 years old, facing 20 years in prison, and the only legacy he would leave was a cautionary tale about bigotry and corruption. He looked up at Terrence with eyes that glistened with something that might have been tears. And he said two words that Terrence had never expected to hear: "I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between them, fragile and imperfect. Terrence studied Whitfield's face, searching for deception, for manipulation, for the performative remorse of a man trying to game the system. He did not find it. What he found instead was a broken human being confronting the ruins of his own making. Terrence stood up from the table. He looked down at Douglas Whitfield, this man who had tried to humiliate him, who had seen his skin color and decided he was worthless, who had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed both their lives in opposite directions. "I forgive you," Terrence said. "Not for your sake. For mine. Carrying hatred is exhausting, and I've got too much work to do to waste energy on that. But understand this, forgiveness doesn't mean what you did was okay. It doesn't mean there aren't consequences. It just means I'm choosing not to let you live rent-free in my head anymore." He turned and walked toward the door. Behind him, Whitfield's voice called out one more time, ragged and desperate, "Agent Mitchell." Terrence paused but did not turn around. "Thank you," Whitfield said. "For coming. For listening. For being better than me." Terrence walked out of the prison into brilliant Georgia sunshine. The air smelled like pine trees and red clay, the familiar sense of his home state. He climbed into his car, sat behind the wheel, and allowed himself a moment to process everything that had just happened. Then he started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and headed north toward Atlanta. There was work to do, cases to solve, justice to pursue. He turned on the radio and found a jazz station playing something slow and smooth. He smiled. That morning at the airport, Douglas Whitfield had looked at Terrence Mitchell and decided that a black man did not belong in first class. He had been catastrophically wrong. Terrence belonged wherever he chose to be. He belonged in the FBI. He belonged in leadership. He belonged in that prison visiting room, offering forgiveness to a broken racist. He belonged to himself, and that was something no one could ever take away. We have reached the end of this incredible journey together, and I want to thank you for staying until the very last word. This story raises so many questions about justice, forgiveness, and the choices we make when confronted with hatred. I want to hear from you in the comments below. What would you have done in Terrence's position? Would you have forgiven Douglas Whitfield, or would you have let him sit with his guilt forever? Share your thoughts, because this community thrives on your perspectives. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, please hit that like button. It tells me that you want more content like this, and it helps other people discover these stories that need to be told. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. We have so many more powerful narratives coming your way, stories about courage, justice, and the triumph of human dignity. And please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Share it on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, anywhere people are talking about what matters. Stories like Terrence's remind us that one person standing firm can change everything. Thank you for being part of this community. May you always remember that your dignity belongs to you. Stay strong, stay proud, and I will see you in the next video. This powerful story teaches us several profound lessons about dignity, justice, and the consequences of hatred. First, your dignity belongs to you and no one else. Terrence Mitchell faced humiliation in front of hundreds of people, but he never lost his composure. He understood that true dignity comes from within, not from how others treat you. Douglas Whitfield tried to strip Terrence of his worth, but in doing so, he only revealed his own emptiness. Second, patience and wisdom are more powerful than anger. Terrence could have immediately revealed his FBI credentials and ended the confrontation. Instead, he waited, gathered evidence, and exposed not just one racist act but an entire criminal network. His restraint turned a moment of discrimination into a landmark case. Third, hatred destroys the one who carries it. Douglas Whitfield spent his entire life believing he was superior to others. That belief led him to corruption, to crime, and ultimately to a prison cell. His racism did not elevate him. It consumed him. Fourth, standing up matters. Harold Jenkins, Richard the attorney, and countless passengers refused to be silent witnesses. Their courage amplified Terrence's voice and ensured that justice could not be ignored. Finally, forgiveness is freedom. When Terrence forgave Whitfield, he was not excusing the man's actions. He was releasing himself from the burden of carrying hatred. That is perhaps the most powerful lesson of all. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through Terrence Mitchell's story. His courage, dignity, and unwavering commitment to justice remind us all that one person can truly make a difference. Now I want to hear your voice in the comments below. What would you have done if you were in Terrence's shoes at that airport gate? Would you have revealed your identity immediately, or would you have waited like he did to expose the full truth? And most importantly, do you believe you could have forgiven Douglas Whitfield after everything he did? If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the importance of standing up against injustice, please hit that like button right now. Your support means everything to this channel and helps spread these important messages to more people around the world. Do not forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. We have so many more narratives of courage, resilience, and triumph waiting for you. Share this video with your friends, your family, and anyone who needs to be reminded that dignity cannot be taken from those who refuse to surrender it. May you always walk with your head held high, knowing that you belong wherever you choose to be. Stay blessed, stay strong, and I will see you in the next story.